In March of 1889, workmen demolishing the abandoned St. Bartholomew's Orphanage in Millbrook, Pennsylvania made a discovery that would haunt the small industrial town for generations. Beneath the basement floor, wrapped in rotting canvas and lime, lay the skeletal remains of 19 children. Between 1877 and 1889, these young souls had vanished without a trace from what the community believed was a beacon of Christian charity. What the Catholic diocese tried to bury in sealed records and what local authorities dismissed as tragic accidents can no longer remain hidden. Before we descend into this dark chapter of Pennsylvania's forgotten history, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the most sinister abuse of innocent lives should continue. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who demand justice for the forgotten, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global network of people who refuse to let these stories disappear. The Harwick family arrived in Millbrook during the harsh winter of 1876, when the St. Bartholomew's Orphanage stood on the brink of closure. The previous director, Father Augustine Morrison, had fled town under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind mounting debts and a building filled with 37 orphan children ranging in age from 4 to 16. The Catholic diocese, desperate to avoid scandal and financial responsibility, welcomed Edmund Harwick's offer to assume control of the failing institution. Edmund Harwick presented himself as a man of God with a calling to serve the most vulnerable. Standing 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and a perfectly groomed beard, he commanded respect wherever he walked. His wife Constance, a former nurse from Philadelphia, possessed the medical knowledge deemed essential for caring for sickly orphans. Their children, 16-year-old Marcus and 14-year-old Evangeline, appeared to be model Catholic youth eager to serve alongside their parents in this noble mission. The townspeople of Millbrook initially embraced the Harwick family as saviors. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Herald, published glowing articles about their dedication to transforming the orphanage into a model institution. Edmund's passionate sermons at Sunday services moved congregants to tears as he spoke of rescuing society's most forgotten children. Constance organized ladies' auxiliary meetings where wealthy wives donated clothing and supplies for the orphans. Marcus and Evangeline were praised for their willingness to sacrifice normal teenage pursuits to help care for younger children. What the community failed to recognize were the subtle warning signs that emerged within the first months of the Harwick family's arrival. Several townspeople later recalled feeling unsettled by young Marcus's intense stare and inappropriate questions about local children's family situations. Others remembered Evangeline's unusual interest in which orphans received visitors and which children had no living relatives. Most disturbing in hindsight were Edmund's detailed inquiries about the legal procedures for declaring orphans dead when they disappeared. The first child vanished on a bitter February night in 1877, just 3 months after the Harwick family took control. 8-year-old Timothy Brennan, whose parents had died in a factory fire, simply disappeared from his dormitory bed. When concerned townspeople asked about Timothy's whereabouts, Edmund explained that the boy had been placed with a loving family in distant Pittsburgh. The official records showed Timothy's transfer to the St. Vincent, Delaware Paul home, but when investigators decades later attempted to verify this placement, no such records existed at the Pittsburgh institution. Timothy's disappearance established a pattern that would claim 18 more young lives over the following 12 years. The children who vanished shared common characteristics that made them perfect targets for the Harwick family's sinister operation. They were orphans with no living relatives, no regular visitors, and no one in the community who would persistently inquire about their welfare. Most were between the ages of 6 and 12, old enough to work but young enough to be easily controlled and manipulated. The Harwick family's method of selecting victims demonstrated a calculated cruelty that defied comprehension. They maintained detailed records of each child's background, noting which orphans had family connections and which were completely alone in the world. These records, discovered years later hidden in the basement walls, revealed a systematic approach to identifying children whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation or community concern. Edmund Harwick's public persona as a devoted Christian leader provided perfect cover for the family's activities. He preached eloquently about the sacred duty to protect innocent children while privately orchestrating their exploitation and murder. His sermons often focused on biblical passages about welcoming orphans and strangers, words that took on horrifying irony when viewed through the lens of his crimes. The community's trust in his religious authority made it nearly impossible for anyone to question his explanations about missing children. The basement of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage became the center of the Harwick family's operation during the winter of 1877. Under the guise of creating additional storage space, Edmund and Marcus spent weeks excavating and reinforcing the underground chambers. They installed soundproofing materials and constructed what they claimed was a prayer room for private meditation and religious instruction. The reality was far more sinister than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. Constance Harwick's nursing background proved invaluable to the family's criminal enterprise. Her medical knowledge allowed her to assess the health and potential value of each child, determining which orphans would be most suitable for their purposes. She maintained detailed health records that served as inventory lists rather than genuine medical care documentation. Her gentle bedside manner and professional medical training made her the perfect accomplice to lure children into the basement chambers where their fates were sealed. The winter of 1877 marked the beginning of 12 years of systematic horror that would claim 19 innocent lives. As snow fell heavily on Millbrook and the community retreated indoors for the harsh Pennsylvania winter, the Harwick family refined their methods and expanded their operation. The children of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, already isolated by poverty and circumstance, became trapped in a nightmare that would only end when the last victim's remains were discovered more than a decade later. The Harwick family's arrival in Millbrook represented the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that began years before they ever set foot in Pennsylvania. Edmund Harwick's background revealed a pattern of deception and manipulation that stretched back to his youth in Baltimore, where he had been expelled from St. Mary's Seminary for what official records described as disturbing behavior toward younger students. The seminary's sealed files, discovered decades later, contained reports of Edmund's obsession with medieval religious practices and his inappropriate interest in corporal punishment as a tool for spiritual purification. Constance Harwick brought her own dark history to their unholy partnership. Born Constance Whitmore in Philadelphia, she had trained as a nurse at Pennsylvania Hospital before being quietly dismissed for stealing morphine and conducting unauthorized medical procedures on indigent patients. Her medical knowledge, combined with her ability to appear caring and professional, made her an invaluable asset to Edmund's evolving plans. Their courtship and marriage in 1859 united two individuals whose shared lack of empathy would prove catastrophic for the innocent children who would later fall under their care. Marcus Harwick inherited his parents' capacity for cruelty while developing his own unique contributions to the family's criminal enterprise. At 16, he possessed an intelligence that might have led to academic success under different circumstances, but his parents had channeled his abilities toward darker purposes. Marcus demonstrated an early fascination with anatomy and dissection, skills he developed through the systematic torture of small animals around their previous residencies. His parents encouraged these interests, recognizing their potential utility for future endeavors. Evangeline Harwick, despite her youth, served as the family's most effective weapon for gaining the trust of vulnerable children. Her innocent appearance and gentle demeanor made her the perfect lure for orphans desperate for kindness and affection. She had been trained from childhood to identify psychological weaknesses in other children and exploit their need for friendship and belonging. Her role in the family's operation demonstrated how evil could corrupt even the youngest members of a household when they were raised without moral boundaries. The family's integration into Millbrook's social fabric proceeded with methodical precision during the spring and summer of 1877. Edmund established relationships with key community leaders, including Mayor William Hutchinson, Sheriff David McKenna, and the prominent businessmen who controlled the town's economic and political life. He positioned himself as a moral authority figure whose opinions on matters of justice and community welfare carried significant weight. His ability to quote scripture and speak eloquently about Christian duty impressed even the most skeptical residents. Constance Harwick's medical expertise made her indispensable to a community that lacked adequate healthcare facilities. She treated injuries and illnesses among the town's poorest residents, often refusing payment while building a reputation for compassion and selfless service. Her work with the orphanage children provided perfect cover for her more sinister activities, as any unusual injuries or symptoms could be attributed to the natural hazards of caring for neglected and malnourished children. The community's gratitude for her medical services created a protective barrier around the entire family. The transformation of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage during 1877 reflected the Harwick family's dual nature as public benefactors and private predators. They invested their own money in improving the building's appearance, installing new windows, repairing the roof, and painting the exterior a cheerful yellow that made the institution appear welcoming and well-maintained. These visible improvements convinced the community that the orphans were receiving excellent care, while the family's real work proceeded in the renovated basement chambers hidden from public view. If this story is giving you chills, you're not alone in recognizing the calculated evil that can hide behind facades of respectability. Share this video with a friend who appreciates dark historical mysteries, and hit that like button to support our investigation into America's forgotten crimes. Don't forget to subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. The children remaining at St. Bartholomew's during the summer of 1877 began to exhibit signs of psychological trauma that concerned some community members. Several orphans displayed unusual fearfulness and reluctance to speak about their daily activities. When questioned by visitors, the children would glance nervously toward family members before providing carefully rehearsed responses about their happiness and gratitude. These behavioral changes were subtle enough that most adults attributed them to the natural adjustment period following the previous director's departure. The Harwick family's success in Millbrook depended on their ability to compartmentalize their public and private identities. During daylight hours, they presented themselves as devoted servants of God and community, earning praise for their sacrifice and dedication. After dark, when the orphanage was sealed from outside observation, they revealed their true nature as predators who viewed the children in their care as nothing more than commodities to be exploited for profit and personal gratification. The autumn of 1877 witnessed the establishment of systematic methods that would govern the Harwick family's operation for the next 12 years. Edmund's careful study of the children under his care revealed patterns of vulnerability that could be exploited with minimal risk of detection. He developed a classification system that divided the orphans into categories based on their potential value and the likelihood that their disappearances would generate investigation. Children with occasional visitors or distant relatives were marked as unsuitable targets, while those completely alone in the world received special attention that would prove fatal. The selection criteria refined during this period demonstrated the family's calculated approach to identifying victims. Children between the ages of 6 and 12 were considered ideal, as they were old enough to understand fear and compliance but young enough to be physically controlled. Orphans who displayed signs of intelligence or leadership among their peers were eliminated first, as the family recognized that such children might organize resistance or attempt to alert outside authorities. Those who were naturally withdrawn or had been traumatized by previous experiences were preferred targets because their changed behavior would be attributed to existing psychological damage rather than new abuse. Marcus Harwick's role in the operation expanded significantly during the fall months as his parents recognized his particular talents for psychological manipulation. At 16, he possessed an intuitive understanding of how to exploit children's deepest fears and desires for acceptance. He would spend hours talking with potential victims, learning about their backgrounds, their dreams, and their greatest fears. This information became ammunition for breaking down their resistance when the time came for them to descend into the basement chambers that had been prepared for their final hours. The basement renovation project, completed in October 1877, created the infrastructure necessary for the family's criminal enterprise. What appeared to be simple storage improvements actually involved the construction of soundproof chambers, drainage systems, and specialized equipment for restraining and controlling victims. Edmund's background in carpentry, learned during his youth before entering seminary, proved invaluable for creating spaces that could contain unspeakable acts without alerting anyone in the floors above. The basement's isolation from the main living areas of the orphanage ensured that screams and pleas for help would never reach the ears of other children or visiting community members. The first systematic victim selection occurred in November 1877, when the family identified 9-year-old Margaret O'Sullivan as their next target. Margaret had arrived at the orphanage 6 months earlier after her parents died in a cholera outbreak that swept through the Irish immigrant community. She had no living relatives and had received no visitors since her placement at St. Bartholomew's. Her quiet nature and tendency to keep to herself made her an ideal candidate for the family's purposes, as her withdrawal from social interaction with other children would not seem unusual when she disappeared. Evangeline Harwick's cultivation of Margaret's trust demonstrated the family's sophisticated approach to victim preparation. Over the course of several weeks, Evangeline positioned herself as Margaret's special friend and protector, offering small gifts and exclusive attention that the lonely child desperately craved. She learned about Margaret's fears of abandonment and her dreams of finding a new family who would love her. This psychological intelligence gathering created detailed profiles that allowed the family to manipulate their victims with surgical precision. The establishment of communication protocols with potential buyers began during the winter months of 1877. Edmund's correspondence, later discovered hidden in the orphanage walls, revealed a network of individuals and institutions willing to pay premium prices for children who met specific criteria. These buyers included private collectors who sought children for unspeakable purposes, medical schools that needed cadavers for anatomical study, and underground adoption services that catered to wealthy clients who preferred to avoid legal scrutiny of their child acquisitions. Constance Harwick's medical examinations of the children took on sinister significance as the family's operation evolved. What appeared to be routine health assessments actually served as detailed evaluations of each child's market value and potential utility to various categories of buyers. She documented physical characteristics, health conditions, and behavioral traits that would influence pricing and buyer interest. Children deemed to have higher market value received better nutrition and medical care to maintain their condition until sale or disposal, while those considered less valuable were often subjected to medical experimentation that satisfied Constance's scientific curiosity. The winter disappearance of Margaret O'Sullivan in December 1877 established the template for future operations. The family's explanation that Margaret had been adopted by a loving Catholic family in distant Pittsburgh satisfied community concerns while providing a believable cover story that could be repeated for subsequent victims. The official paperwork, forged by Edmund using his knowledge of ecclesiastical procedures, appeared legitimate to anyone who might casually review the orphanage records. Margaret's actual fate, revealed only when her remains were discovered 12 years later, demonstrated the gap between the family's public explanations and their private actions. The success of Margaret's disappearance convinced the Harwick family that their methods were sound and their risk of detection minimal. The community's acceptance of their explanation and the lack of any official investigation emboldened them to accelerate their timeline for future operations. By the end of 1877, they had identified their next 3 victims and begun the psychological preparation process that would make those children easier to control when their time came to descend into the basement chambers that had become their tomb. The spring of 1878 brought refinements to the Harwick family's operation that would increase both their efficiency and their profits over the following decade. Edmund's correspondence with buyers had revealed specific preferences and requirements that could command premium prices, leading the family to develop more sophisticated methods for preparing and categorizing their victims. Children with particular physical characteristics, educational backgrounds, or behavioral traits were identified as specialty commodities that could generate significantly higher revenues than standard transactions. The development of coded record-keeping systems during this period demonstrated the family's growing confidence in their criminal enterprise. Edmund created an elaborate filing system that used religious terminology and biblical references to disguise the true nature of their activities from anyone who might accidentally discover the documents. Children were referred to as lambs, buyers were described as shepherds, and transactions were recorded as placements in various heavenly kingdoms. This coded language allowed the family to maintain detailed business records while providing plausible explanations if their paperwork was ever scrutinized by suspicious authorities. Marcus Harwick's psychological techniques evolved throughout 1878 as he refined his ability to break down children's resistance and prepare them for their ultimate fate. He discovered that children who were completely isolated from peer support became more compliant and less likely to attempt escape or rebellion. His systematic campaign to turn orphans against each other created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear that made collective resistance impossible. Children who might have banded together to protect each other instead competed for the family's approval, unaware that such attention marked them for elimination. The expansion of the basement facilities during the summer months reflected the family's plans for increased production volume. Additional chambers were constructed with improved soundproofing and more sophisticated restraint systems that allowed for longer periods of confinement before final disposition. Edmund's carpentry skills, combined with Marcus's innovative suggestions, created spaces that could accommodate multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining the security necessary to prevent discovery by the orphans living in the floors above. Constance Harwick's medical procedures became increasingly experimental as she recognized the opportunity to advance her understanding of human anatomy and physiology through unrestricted access to living subjects. Her nursing training had provided basic knowledge of medical techniques, but her work in the basement chambers allowed her to explore procedures that would have been impossible in legitimate medical settings. The detailed notes she maintained about her experiments provided valuable information for potential buyers while satisfying her scientific curiosity about the limits of human endurance and the effects of various chemical compounds. The victim selection process underwent significant improvements during the autumn of 1878, incorporating lessons learned from Margaret O'Sullivan's disappearance and the family's growing understanding of community dynamics. Children who had formed strong friendships with other orphans were avoided, as their disappearances might prompt persistent questions from peers who cared about their welfare. Instead, the family focused on recently arrived orphans who had not yet established social connections within the institution. The establishment of multiple disposal methods provided the family with flexibility in managing evidence and maintaining their cover stories. While some victims were sold to buyers who removed them from the premises alive, others were killed on-site and their remains processed according to specific buyer requirements. Medical schools paid premium prices for fresh cadavers with particular characteristics, while private collectors sought preserved specimens that demonstrated Constance's growing expertise in anatomical preparation techniques. The winter months of 1878 witnessed the disappearance of twin Samuel and Sarah Mitchell, ages 7 and 8, whose parents had died in a mining accident 6 months earlier. The simultaneous disappearance of siblings presented new challenges for the family's cover story operations, but Edmund's explanation that the children had been adopted together by a wealthy family in Baltimore satisfied community concerns. The twins' actual fate involved their sale to a private collector who had specifically requested siblings for his personal collection of anatomical specimens. The success of the Mitchell twins' disappearance validated the family's refined operational methods and convinced them that they could handle more complex transactions without increasing their risk of detection. The premium prices paid for specialty victims like siblings encouraged the family to seek out other unique opportunities that could maximize their profits while advancing their reputation among discriminating buyers who appreciated their professional approach to victim preparation and delivery. The psychological impact on surviving orphans became an unexpected benefit of the family's operations, as the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty made the remaining children more compliant and less likely to challenge authority. Orphans who witnessed the disappearances of their peers understood that questioning the family's explanations or displaying curiosity about missing children could result in their own elimination. This climate of terror served as an effective management tool that reduced the need for physical discipline while ensuring absolute cooperation from potential future victims. By the end of 1878, the Harwick family had established a systematic operation that would continue largely unchanged for the next decade. Their methods had been tested and refined through practical experience, their network of buyers had been cultivated and expanded, and their position within the Millbrook community had been solidified through continued demonstrations of public service and Christian devotion. The foundation was in place for years of profitable criminal activity that would claim 17 more innocent lives before their eventual discovery and downfall. The years 1881 through 1884 marked the peak of the Harwick family's criminal enterprise, a period when their confidence, profits, and body count reached unprecedented levels. During these 3 years, 8 children would vanish from St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, representing the highest concentration of disappearances in the family's 12-year reign of terror. The systematic nature of these eliminations demonstrated how completely the family had perfected their methods while expanding their network of buyers and accomplices throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Edmund Harwick's reputation within the broader Catholic community had grown to the point where he was invited to speak at diocesan conferences about innovative approaches to orphan care and child welfare. His presentations, filled with manufactured statistics about successful adoptions and glowing testimonials from fictional families, earned him recognition as a leader in institutional management. This elevated status provided perfect cover for his criminal activities while creating additional opportunities to identify potential buyers among wealthy Catholic families who attended these religious gatherings. The expansion of their buyer network during this period included connections with medical institutions as far away as New York and Baltimore, where Constance's anatomical specimens commanded premium prices from professors who appreciated the quality of her preservation techniques. Her reputation for delivering fresh, undamaged cadavers with detailed medical histories made her a preferred supplier for anatomy departments that required specimens meeting specific educational requirements. The financial returns from these transactions provided the family with resources to further expand and improve their operation. Marcus Harwick, now 20 years old, had developed into the family's most effective weapon for psychological manipulation and victim preparation. His ability to gain children's trust while systematically breaking down their emotional defenses had been honed through years of practice on dozens of vulnerable orphans. He understood exactly how long the preparation process should take for different personality types, and his timing had become so precise that he could predict within days when a particular child would be ready for elimination. The introduction of Deputy Marshal Thomas Kellerman as a paid accomplice in 1882 provided the family with crucial protection from potential law enforcement investigations. Kellerman's gambling debts and alcoholism made him susceptible to bribery, and his position within the county sheriff's department gave him access to information about any inquiries or concerns that might threaten the family's operation. His willingness to misdirect investigations and suppress evidence in exchange for regular payments ensured that official scrutiny of the orphanage remained minimal. Evangeline Harwick, approaching her 21st birthday, had evolved from a teenage accomplice into a sophisticated operator whose innocent appearance continued to serve as the perfect disguise for her predatory nature. Her ability to identify psychological vulnerabilities in newly arrived orphans had become so refined that she could predict which children would be most suitable for various categories of buyers. Her detailed psychological profiles of potential victims became valuable marketing tools that allowed the family to command higher prices from discriminating collectors. The disappearance of 10-year-old Joseph Crawford in September 1882 exemplified the family's peak operational efficiency. Joseph, whose parents had died in a factory explosion, had been at the orphanage for only 3 months when Evangeline identified him as an ideal candidate for a Boston collector who specialized in intelligent children with specific physical characteristics. The preparation process took exactly 6 weeks, during which Marcus systematically isolated Joseph from other orphans while building his trust through promises of special treatment and eventual adoption by a loving family. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing as we are, you're witnessing how systematic evil can operate behind facades of respectability and religious authority. This is exactly the kind of hidden history that needs to be exposed and remembered. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be told, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest secrets. Share this with someone who appreciates true crime history that goes beyond the surface. The financial success of the operation during this peak period allowed the family to make significant improvements to their facilities and equipment. The basement chambers were expanded and modernized with better ventilation systems, improved drainage, and more sophisticated restraint mechanisms. These upgrades increased the family's capacity to handle multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining the security and sound containment necessary to avoid detection by orphans or visitors in the upper floors of the building. Constance Harwick's medical experimentation reached new levels of sophistication during 1883 and 1884, as her growing expertise attracted buyers who paid premium prices for specimens that demonstrated particular anatomical conditions or the effects of specific procedures. Her detailed documentation of experimental results provided valuable research data for medical institutions while generating additional revenue streams beyond the basic cadaver trade. The combination of scientific curiosity and financial incentive drove her to push the boundaries of what could be accomplished within the constraints of their covert operation. The psychological toll on surviving orphans became increasingly severe as the disappearance rate accelerated during the peak years. Children who had been at the institution for extended periods developed symptoms of chronic anxiety and depression that were attributed to their traumatic backgrounds rather than their current environment. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that pervaded St. Bartholomew's made the remaining orphans more compliant and easier to control, but it also increased the risk that someone might eventually break down and reveal the truth about what was happening in the basement chambers. The family's confidence in their methods and their sense of invulnerability reached dangerous levels by the end of 1884. 8 successful eliminations in 4 years, combined with growing profits and expanding influence within the community, convinced them that they had achieved a perfect criminal operation that could continue indefinitely without detection. This overconfidence would prove to be their greatest vulnerability as they entered the middle years of their enterprise, when unexpected challenges would begin to threaten the careful facade they had constructed around their horrific activities. The winter of 1884 brought the Harwick family's first serious brush with exposure when Inspector William Garrett from the diocesan office arrived for an unannounced visit to review the orphanage's financial records and operational procedures. Garrett's reputation for thoroughness and his background in criminal investigation made him a genuine threat to the family's carefully constructed facade. His 3-day inspection would test every aspect of their security measures and force them to confront the possibility that their operation might not be as invisible as they had believed. Inspector Garrett's arrival on a frigid February morning caught the family off guard, but their years of preparation for such contingencies allowed them to respond with practiced efficiency. Edmund immediately activated their emergency protocols, sending markers to ensure that all basement chambers were sealed and that any evidence of recent activities was completely eliminated. Constance began preparing cover stories for any unusual medical supplies or equipment that might be discovered, while Evangeline coached the remaining orphans on appropriate responses to questions about missing children. The inspection's most dangerous moment came when Garrett insisted on examining the basement storage areas, claiming that his experience had taught him that institutional problems were often hidden in spaces that administrators assumed visitors would never see. Edmund's heart rate accelerated as he led the inspector down the narrow wooden stairs, knowing that a single oversight in their cleanup procedures could expose the entire operation. The soundproofing materials and specialized drainage systems would be impossible to explain if Garrett possessed the knowledge to recognize their true purpose. Garrett's examination of the basement lasted nearly 2 hours, during which he questioned the need for such extensive renovations in what should have been simple storage space. His background in criminal investigation had trained him to notice details that ordinary visitors would overlook, and several aspects of the basement's configuration struck him as unusual for an orphanage. The multiple chambers, the heavy doors with external locking mechanisms, and the sophisticated ventilation system seemed more appropriate for a commercial facility than a charitable institution. The family's salvation came through Edmund's quick thinking and his deep understanding of bureaucratic psychology. When Garrett expressed concern about the basement modifications, Edmund explained that they had been necessary to create secure storage for valuable donations and sensitive records that required protection from theft and environmental damage. He produced falsified documentation showing large monetary donations from prominent Catholic families who insisted that their contributions be stored in bank vault conditions to prevent loss or misappropriation. Constance Harwick's medical credentials proved crucial in deflecting Garrett's questions about unusual supplies and equipment found throughout the facility. Her explanations about treating orphans with complex medical conditions satisfied the inspector's concerns while demonstrating the family's dedication to providing comprehensive healthcare for their charges. The presence of surgical instruments and experimental medications was attributed to her volunteer work with local physicians who allowed her to practice advanced procedures under their supervision. The psychological pressure of maintaining their cover stories during Garrett's intensive questioning revealed cracks in the family's unity that had not been apparent during their previous years of smooth operation. Marcus struggled to control his temper when repeatedly asked about his interactions with the orphans, while Evangeline's usually perfect composure slipped several times when discussing children who had supposedly been adopted by distant families. These moments of weakness reminded the family that their criminal enterprise depended on flawless coordination and absolute commitment from every member. Garrett's final report to the diocesan office contained several recommendations for improved record-keeping and financial oversight, but he concluded that the Harwick family was providing exemplary care for the orphans under their supervision. His failure to detect the criminal operation resulted from the family's sophisticated deception techniques and his own assumptions about the impossibility of such systematic evil existing within a Catholic institution. The report's positive assessment provided the family with renewed credibility while identifying areas where their security measures needed strengthening. The aftermath of Garrett's inspection prompted significant changes in the family's operational security that would govern their activities for the remaining years of their criminal enterprise. They implemented new protocols for evidence disposal, established better communication systems for emergency situations, and created additional cover stories for aspects of their operation that had proven vulnerable to scrutiny. The near exposure had shaken their confidence but also motivated them to achieve even higher levels of operational security. The elimination of potential witness threats became a priority following the inspection, as the family recognized that surviving orphans who had been at the institution for extended periods possessed dangerous knowledge about missing children and unusual activities. 17-year-old Catherine Walsh, who had lived at St. Bartholomew's for 5 years and had begun asking uncomfortable questions about disappeared friends, was identified as an immediate threat that required elimination despite her age falling outside their normal victim parameters. Catherine's death in March 1885, officially attributed to a tragic accident involving a fall down the basement stairs, demonstrated the family's willingness to expand their killing beyond the profitable elimination of younger children when their security was threatened. Her knowledge of the institution's operations and her growing suspicions about the fate of missing orphans made her elimination a necessity that overrode their usual preference for victims who could generate revenue through sale to buyers. The implementation of enhanced psychological control measures following the inspection created an even more oppressive atmosphere within the orphanage, as the family sought to prevent future situations where older orphans might develop dangerous curiosity about their missing peers. Children were systematically isolated from each other through carefully orchestrated conflicts and artificial grievances that prevented the formation of supportive relationships that might encourage resistance or investigation. The divide-and-conquer strategy ensured that no individual orphan possessed enough information or emotional support to pose a serious threat to the operation's security. The arrival of Father Michael O'Brien in Millbrook during the summer of 1886 marked the beginning of the end for the Harwick family's reign of terror at St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. Unlike his predecessors who had accepted the family's explanations without question, Father O'Brien brought a sharp intellect and an investigative background that made him uniquely qualified to recognize the inconsistencies and warning signs that others had overlooked. His appointment to St. Catherine's Parish, which held supervisory responsibility for the orphanage, would prove to be the catalyst that eventually exposed the systematic murder of 19 innocent children. Father O'Brien's suspicions began during his first official visit to the orphanage in August 1886, when he attempted to reconcile the institution's records with diocesan documentation about child placements and adoptions. The discrepancies he discovered were subtle but significant, involving children who had supposedly been transferred to other institutions that had no record of receiving them. His requests for clarification from Edmund Harwick were met with elaborate explanations that raised more questions than they answered, particularly regarding the unusually high number of successful adoptions by families who preferred to remain anonymous. The priest's background as a former military chaplain during the Civil War had exposed him to human evil in its rawest forms, making him less susceptible to the charm and religious rhetoric that had protected the Harwick family from previous scrutiny. His experience counseling soldiers who had witnessed atrocities had taught him to recognize the psychological patterns displayed by individuals capable of systematic violence. Edmund's overly detailed explanations and defensive responses triggered instincts that Father O'Brien had developed through years of dealing with men who harbored dark secrets. The growing tension between Father O'Brien and the Harwick family became apparent during the autumn months of 1886, as the priest's questions became more pointed and his visits to the orphanage more frequent. His insistence on personally meeting with individual orphans, despite Edmund's protests about disrupting their routines, revealed the atmosphere of fear and silence that pervaded the institution. Children who should have been comfortable speaking with a priest instead displayed the nervous behaviors of individuals who had been coached on what they could and could not reveal to outsiders. Father O'Brien's most significant discovery came in November 1886, when 15-year-old orphan Daniel Murphy broke down during what was supposed to be a routine confession and revealed fragments of information about children who had disappeared into the basement chambers and never returned. Daniel's testimony was incomplete and confused, as the psychological trauma inflicted by years of witnessing systematic elimination had damaged his ability to provide coherent accounts of what he had seen. However, his references to screams from the basement and the smell of chemicals provided Father O'Brien with concrete evidence that something horrific was occurring within the institution. The priest's attempts to gather additional information were hampered by the climate of terror that the Harwick family had cultivated among the surviving orphans. Children who might have been willing to speak were too frightened to risk the consequences of betraying the family's secrets, while those who possessed the most damaging information had already been eliminated to prevent exactly this type of exposure. Father O'Brien recognized that traditional approaches to gathering testimony would be insufficient given the psychological control that the family exercised over their potential witnesses. The development of a covert investigation network during the winter months of 1886 demonstrated Father O'Brien's understanding that exposing the Harwick family would require evidence-gathering techniques that circumvented their security measures. He began cultivating relationships with former employees of the orphanage, community members who had noticed unusual activities, and medical professionals who might have knowledge about the family's acquisition of supplies and equipment. This network allowed him to piece together a pattern of suspicious behavior that extended far beyond the orphanage walls. Are you as shocked as we are by the systematic nature of this evil and the courage it took for people like Father O'Brien to pursue the truth? This is exactly why we investigate these forgotten stories, because brave individuals who refuse to look the other way deserve to be remembered. If you're committed to uncovering hidden history like this, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments what you think about Father O'Brien's investigation and whether you believe justice was ultimately served. The discovery of Deputy Marshal Kellerman's financial connection to the Harwick family came through Father O'Brien's examination of public records and his conversations with local merchants who had noticed the lawman's sudden improvement in economic circumstances. Kellerman's new house, expensive clothing, and frequent gambling activities were inconsistent with his official salary, suggesting that he was receiving payments from undisclosed sources. Father O'Brien's military experience had taught him that corruption often followed predictable patterns, and Kellerman's lifestyle changes matched the profile of an official who had been compromised by criminal elements. The priest's correspondence with diocesan authorities during early 1887 reflected his growing certainty that a massive criminal conspiracy was operating under the cover of charitable work, but his reports were met with skepticism from superiors who found it difficult to believe that such systematic evil could exist within a Catholic institution. The diocese's reluctance to authorize a formal investigation forced Father O'Brien to continue his covert evidence gathering while walking a dangerous line between his duty to expose the truth and his need to avoid alerting the Harwick family to the extent of his knowledge. The formation of an underground network of concerned citizens during the spring of 1887 represented the beginning of organized resistance to the Harwick family's criminal enterprise. Father O'Brien's careful recruitment of allies included Dr. Henry Morrison, whose medical practice had been undermined by Constance Harwick's illegal activities, merchant Samuel Bradley, who had noticed unusual purchasing patterns by the family, and teacher Elizabeth Warren, who had taught several of the disappeared children and harbored suspicions about their supposed adoptions. This network provided the priest with resources and support that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation with the criminal family that had terrorized Millbrook's orphans for nearly a decade. The breakthrough in Father O'Brien's investigation came on a rain-soaked night in April 1887, when 15-year-old Sarah Hennessy managed to escape from St. Bartholomew's Orphanage and reach the safety of St. Catherine's Rectory. Sarah's harrowing journey through the muddy streets of Millbrook, running barefoot in her nightgown while bleeding from fresh wounds inflicted during her captivity in the basement chambers, provided Father O'Brien with the first eyewitness testimony from someone who had survived the Harwick family's systematic torture and lived to tell about their crimes. Sarah's account, delivered in whispered fragments over several days as she recovered from her physical and psychological trauma, revealed the true scope of the horror that had been occurring beneath the orphanage for nearly a decade. She described watching helplessly as younger children were dragged screaming into the basement chambers, hearing their cries for help echoing through the ventilation system, and witnessing Constance Harwick's medical experiments on victims who were kept alive for days while enduring procedures that served no purpose beyond satisfying her scientific curiosity and the specific requirements of paying customers. The detailed information that Sarah provided about the basement's layout, the specialized equipment used for restraining and torturing victims, and the coded record-keeping system employed by the family gave Father O'Brien the concrete evidence he needed to move beyond suspicion toward formal accusation. Her descriptions of the multiple chambers, each designed for specific aspects of the criminal operation, demonstrated the systematic nature of the enterprise and the level of planning that had gone into creating a facility capable of processing multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining absolute secrecy. Father O'Brien's documentation of Sarah's testimony required careful balance between preserving crucial evidence and protecting a traumatized young woman whose psychological stability remained fragile following her escape. His experience as a military chaplain had taught him techniques for helping trauma victims recall details without forcing them to relive experiences that might cause additional damage. The priest's patient approach allowed Sarah to gradually reveal information that painted a comprehensive picture of the Harwick family's methods, their network of buyers, and the fate of the 19 children who had disappeared over the previous decade. The discovery of the coded ledgers during Father O'Brien's covert search of the orphanage in May 1887 provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the full extent of the criminal operation. His midnight infiltration of the building, conducted while the Harwick family attended a diocesan conference in Philadelphia, revealed the sophisticated record-keeping system that Edmund had developed to track victims, buyers, and financial transactions. The ledgers, hidden behind false walls in Edmund's private office, contained detailed information about each child's elimination, including their physical characteristics, the preparation methods used, and the final disposition of their remains. The coded language used in the ledgers initially presented challenges for Father O'Brien's interpretation, but Sarah's intimate knowledge of the family's terminology allowed him to decipher the meaning behind Edmund's biblical references and religious metaphors. Children were categorized by age, physical condition, and market value, with detailed notes about buyer preferences and pricing structures that revealed the commercial nature of what the community had believed was charitable work. The financial records showed payments totaling thousands of dollars over the previous decade, demonstrating that the elimination of orphans had become a profitable business enterprise. The identification of the buyer network through the decoded ledgers exposed a conspiracy that extended far beyond the Harwick family to include medical institutions, private collectors, and underground adoption services throughout the northeastern United States. The list of customers revealed respected members of society who had participated in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children, including physicians who purchased cadavers for illegal experimentation, wealthy individuals who collected anatomical specimens for private museums, and adoption brokers who supplied children to clients willing to pay premium prices for complete anonymity. Father O'Brien's correspondence with Bishop Thomas McKenna in Philadelphia during June 1887 marked the beginning of official church involvement in the investigation, as the priest's detailed reports and supporting evidence convinced diocesan authorities that immediate action was necessary to prevent additional murders. The bishop's decision to authorize a formal investigation while maintaining secrecy about the ongoing inquiry allowed Father O'Brien to continue gathering evidence without alerting the Harwick family to the imminent threat to their operation. The priest's collaboration with Dr. Henry Morrison to analyze the medical aspects of the evidence revealed the sophisticated nature of Constance Harwick's experimental procedures and her growing expertise in anatomical preservation techniques. Dr. Morrison's professional knowledge allowed him to interpret the medical terminology in the ledgers and understand the specific procedures that had been performed on victims before their death. His analysis confirmed that many children had been subjected to experimental surgeries and chemical treatments that served no therapeutic purpose but provided valuable research data for buyers who paid premium prices for such specialized specimens. The establishment of communication protocols with federal authorities during the summer of 1887 reflected Father O'Brien's understanding that the scope of the criminal conspiracy required intervention beyond local law enforcement capabilities. His careful documentation of interstate commerce violations, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges provided federal marshals with a legal framework necessary to assume jurisdiction over the case while bypassing the corrupt local officials who had been protecting the Harwick family's operation through bribery and intimidation. The psychological preparation of Sarah Hennessy for her eventual testimony required months of careful counseling and support from Father O'Brien and his network of allies. Her willingness to face the Harwick family in court and provide detailed testimony about their crimes would prove crucial to securing convictions, but the emotional cost of reliving her traumatic experiences presented significant challenges that needed to be addressed before any legal proceedings could begin. The priest's commitment to protecting Sarah while ensuring that justice was served for the 19 murdered children demonstrated his understanding that the pursuit of truth required balancing the needs of survivors with the demands of the legal system. The autumn of 1887 brought escalating tension between Father O'Brien and the Harwick family as both sides maneuvered for position in what had become an inevitable confrontation. Edmund Harwick's attempts to have the troublesome priest transferred to a distant parish reflected his growing awareness that their operation faced the most serious threat in its 10-year history. His carefully worded complaints to Bishop McKenna about Father O'Brien's interference in orphanage operations and his questioning of established procedures represented a desperate attempt to eliminate the investigation before it could expose their criminal enterprise. The Harwick family's recognition that Sarah Hennessy posed an existential threat to their operation led to increasingly frantic efforts to locate and eliminate the escaped witness before she could provide testimony to authorities. Marcus Harwick's systematic search of Millbrook's neighborhoods, conducted under the pretense of looking for a runaway orphan who needed medical attention, revealed the family's willingness to take enormous risks to protect their secrets. His inquiries at local businesses and boarding houses demonstrated a level of desperation that marked a significant departure from their previous careful approach to security. The mysterious death of Sarah Hennessy in September 1887, officially attributed to drowning in Beaver Creek, represented the Harwick family's most brazen attempt to eliminate evidence of their crimes. The discovery of her body, found floating face down in shallow water despite her known swimming abilities, immediately aroused suspicion among Father O'Brien's network of allies. The convenient timing of her death, occurring just days before she was scheduled to provide formal testimony to federal investigators, left little doubt that her elimination had been orchestrated by the criminal family she had exposed. Father O'Brien's devastation at Sarah's murder was compounded by his recognition that her death had eliminated the most credible witness to the Harwick family's crimes while demonstrating their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. The priest's subsequent decision to accelerate his evidence gathering and share his findings with federal authorities reflected his understanding that delay would only provide the family with additional opportunities to eliminate witnesses and destroy incriminating documentation. Sarah's sacrifice had provided crucial information about the criminal operation, but her death also served as a warning about the dangers faced by anyone who opposed the family's systematic murder of innocent children. The destruction of evidence during the weeks following Sarah's death demonstrated the Harwick family's sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation procedures and their determination to eliminate any documentation that could support prosecution efforts. Edmund's systematic burning of ledgers, correspondence, and financial records removed much of the written evidence that Father O'Brien had hoped to use against them. However, the priest's earlier copying of key documents during his covert search had preserved crucial information that would eventually prove instrumental in securing convictions. The family's preparation for potential escape became increasingly apparent during October 1887, as they began liquidating assets and establishing alternative identities that would allow them to relocate if their operation became untenable. Constance's disposal of medical equipment and experimental specimens eliminated evidence of her anatomical work while generating funds for their potential flight. The family's discussions about relocating to distant states where they could establish new identities and resume their criminal activities revealed their belief that their methods were too profitable to abandon permanently. The elimination of the remaining orphan witnesses during November 1887 represented the Harwick family's final attempt to prevent testimony that could expose their crimes. The deaths of 3 older children, officially attributed to a typhoid outbreak that conveniently affected only those orphans who possessed dangerous knowledge about the basement operations, removed the last eyewitnesses to a decade of systematic murder. The suspicious nature of these deaths, occurring in rapid succession among healthy children who had shown no previous symptoms of illness, provided additional evidence of the family's willingness to kill anyone who threatened their security. Father O'Brien's race against time to preserve evidence and protect potential witnesses intensified during the final months of 1887, as he recognized that the Harwick family's growing desperation made them increasingly dangerous to anyone who posed a threat to their operation. His secret communication with federal marshals accelerated as he provided detailed information about the family's methods, their network of accomplices, and the evidence that would be necessary to secure convictions. The priest's commitment to exposing the truth, despite the obvious risks to his own safety, demonstrated the moral courage required to confront systematic evil when official authorities had been compromised. The discovery of additional burial sites on the orphanage grounds during Father O'Brien's nighttime excavations provided horrifying confirmation of the true scope of the Harwick family's crimes. The remains of children who had been killed and buried on the property, rather than sold to buyers, revealed that the family's operation had included victims beyond the 19 children whose disappearances had been officially documented. These additional discoveries suggested that the total number of murders might have been significantly higher than initially suspected, with some victims eliminated for experimental purposes or personal gratification rather than commercial profit. The psychological toll of investigating such systematic evil began to affect Father O'Brien's health and emotional stability during the final months of 1887, as the cumulative impact of documenting child murder, torture, and exploitation challenged his faith in human decency and divine justice. His private correspondence revealed a man struggling to reconcile his religious beliefs with the evidence of systematic evil that he had uncovered, while maintaining the determination necessary to ensure that justice was served for the innocent victims whose lives had been destroyed by the Harwick family's criminal enterprise. The family's final preparations for confrontation with authorities included the establishment of defensive positions within the orphanage and the acquisition of weapons that would allow them to resist arrest if their operation was discovered. Edmund's conversion of the basement chambers into a fortified position, complete with multiple escape routes and stockpiled supplies, demonstrated his determination to avoid capture even if it meant engaging in armed conflict with law enforcement officers. The family's willingness to transform their criminal operation into a potential battleground revealed the depths of their desperation and their recognition that exposure would likely result in execution for their crimes. The winter of 1888 brought the final phase of Father O'Brien's investigation as his secret documentation reached federal authorities who possessed the jurisdiction and resources necessary to bypass the corrupt local officials protecting the Harwick family. United States Marshal William Harrison's arrival in Philadelphia during January 1888 marked the beginning of federal involvement in what had become the largest child murder investigation in Pennsylvania's history. The Marshal's review of Father O'Brien's evidence, including the copied ledgers, witness testimony, and photographic documentation of burial sites, convinced federal authorities that immediate action was necessary to prevent additional murders and apprehend the perpetrators before they could escape justice. The planning for the federal raid on St. Bartholomew's Orphanage required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and absolute secrecy to prevent the Harwick family from receiving advance warning of the impending operation. Marshal Harrison's team included specialists in handling fortified positions and experts in gathering evidence from crime scenes involving multiple victims. The federal authorities, understanding that they were confronting a criminal enterprise capable of systematic violence and sophisticated counter-surveillance measures, led them to prepare for armed resistance and potential hostage situations involving the surviving orphans still trapped within the institution. The surprise raid, launched at dawn on February 15, 1888, caught the Harwick family in the midst of their final preparations for escape, as federal marshals surrounded the orphanage and cut off all routes that the criminals might have used to flee. The timing of the operation, conducted while the family believed they were still undetected, prevented the destruction of crucial evidence and the elimination of remaining witnesses who could provide testimony about the systematic murders that had occurred over the previous decade. The federal agent's swift seizure of the building and immediate securing of the basement chambers ensured that physical evidence would be preserved for prosecution efforts. The discovery of the basement torture chambers exceeded even the horrific expectations that Marshal Harrison had developed based on Father O'Brien's detailed reports about the Harwick family's methods and facilities. The multiple rooms equipped with restraint devices, surgical instruments, and chemical preservation equipment provided undeniable physical evidence of systematic torture and murder that had been conducted with scientific precision over many years. The specialized drainage systems and soundproofing materials demonstrated the level of planning and investment that had gone into creating a facility capable of processing multiple victims while maintaining absolute secrecy from the community above. The recovery of human remains from concealed burial sites throughout the orphanage grounds provided investigators with physical evidence that corroborated the documentary proof contained in Edmund Harwick's coded ledgers. The skeletal remains of 19 children, ranging in age from 6 to 15, were methodically excavated and catalogued by federal investigators who worked to identify individual victims and determine the cause of death in each case. The condition of the remains, many showing evidence of systematic torture and experimental medical procedures, confirmed the most horrific aspects of the testimony that had been provided by escaped witness Sarah Hennessy before her murder. The attempted escape of the Harwick family during the federal raid demonstrated their recognition that capture would likely result in execution for their crimes against innocent children. Edmund's desperate attempt to reach the basement armory where the family had stockpiled weapons and supplies for a prolonged siege ended when federal agents cornered him in the main corridor and forced his surrender at gunpoint. Constance's effort to destroy remaining medical records and experimental documentation was interrupted by marshals who preserved crucial evidence about her anatomical work and the network of buyers who had purchased specimens from her illegal operations. Marcus Harwick's violent resistance during the raid resulted in a gun battle that left one federal agent wounded and demonstrated the young man's willingness to kill law enforcement officers rather than face trial for his participation in systematic child murder. His eventual capture, following a basement shootout that lasted nearly an hour, provided investigators with access to detailed knowledge about the family's methods and the fate of individual victims. Marcus's intimate involvement in every aspect of the criminal operation made him a valuable source of information about the network of accomplices and buyers who had facilitated the family's crimes. Evangeline Harwick's capture while attempting to flee through a concealed tunnel that connected the orphanage basement to an abandoned building demonstrated the family's sophisticated escape planning and their determination to avoid accountability for their actions. Her possession of false identity documents and substantial cash reserves revealed the extent of their preparation for potential discovery. Despite her youth, Evangeline's detailed knowledge of the victim selection process and her role in gaining children's trust made her testimony crucial for understanding how the family had maintained their operation for over a decade without detection. What's most chilling about this moment is realizing how close the Harwick family came to escaping justice completely. If not for Father O'Brien's courage and determination, this systematic murder of 19 innocent children might have continued indefinitely. This is exactly why we investigate these forgotten cases, because the victims deserve to be remembered and their stories need to be told. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in preserving these important historical truths, and let us know in the comments what you think should have happened to the family members who committed these unthinkable crimes. The interrogation of Deputy Marshal Thomas Kellerman following his arrest on federal corruption charges revealed the extent of official complicity that had protected the Harwick family's criminal operation for nearly a decade. Kellerman's detailed confession about receiving regular payments in exchange for misdirecting investigations and suppressing evidence provided prosecutors with crucial testimony about the broader conspiracy that had enabled systematic child murder. His cooperation with federal investigators, motivated by promises of reduced sentencing, exposed other corrupt officials who had accepted bribes to ignore suspicious activities at the orphanage. The seizure of financial records and correspondence during the raid provided federal investigators with detailed information about the Harwick family's network of buyers and the commercial aspects of their criminal enterprise. The discovery of payment receipts, shipping manifests, and customer lists revealed a sophisticated business operation that had generated substantial profits through the systematic exploitation and murder of vulnerable children. The evidence demonstrated that the elimination of orphans had evolved from opportunistic crime into a calculated commercial enterprise that supplied specialized products to discriminating customers throughout the northeastern United States. The psychological evaluation of surviving orphans who had witnessed the family's crimes provided investigators with additional testimony about the methods used to control and terrorize children while maintaining the facade of charitable work. The traumatized survivors' accounts of systematic psychological abuse, threats of violence, and forced complicity in concealing evidence revealed the comprehensive nature of the family's control over their victims. These testimonies would prove crucial in prosecution efforts while highlighting the long-term damage inflicted on children who had survived the Harwick family's reign of terror at St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. The trial of the Harwick family in the spring of 1889 became a national sensation as newspapers across the country reported the horrific details of systematic child murder that had been concealed behind the facade of Christian charity for over a decade. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia was packed with spectators, journalists, and officials from child welfare organizations who recognized that the case would establish crucial precedents for protecting vulnerable children from institutional abuse. The prosecution's presentation of evidence, including the recovered remains of 19 victims and detailed documentation of the family's commercial murder enterprise, shocked even experienced court officials who had witnessed numerous criminal trials. Edmund Harwick's courtroom demeanor during the proceedings revealed the same manipulative charm that had allowed him to deceive the Millbrook community for years, as he attempted to portray himself as a devoted servant of God whose charitable work had been misunderstood by overzealous investigators. His testimony, filled with biblical quotations and references to his sacred duty to care for orphan children, rang hollow when confronted with physical evidence of torture chambers and coded ledgers documenting victim sales. The jury's reaction to his performance demonstrated that his powers of persuasion were ineffective when faced with overwhelming proof of systematic cruelty toward innocent children. The prosecution's star witness, Father Michael O'Brien, provided devastating testimony that methodically dismantled the family's defense strategy while honoring the memory of the murdered children who could no longer speak for themselves. His detailed account of the investigation, supported by photographic evidence and documentary proof of the crimes, established a comprehensive timeline of the family's criminal activities from their arrival in Millbrook through their eventual capture. The priest's emotional testimony about discovering the remains of 19 children buried beneath the orphanage moved spectators to tears while reinforcing the systematic nature of the murders. Constance Harwick's medical background became a liability during her testimony as prosecutors demonstrated how her nursing training had been perverted to serve commercial murder rather than healing. The detailed evidence of her anatomical experiments and preservation techniques revealed a level of scientific cruelty that shocked medical professionals in the courtroom audience. Her attempts to justify her actions as necessary medical research were undermined by testimony from buyers who described purchasing specimens for private collections rather than legitimate educational purposes. The revelation that she had tortured children to death while documenting their suffering for commercial purposes established her as equally culpable with her husband in the systematic murders. Marcus Harwick's psychological evaluation during the trial proceedings revealed the disturbing development of a young man who had been raised to view child murder as normal family business rather than unconscionable crime. His detailed testimony about victim selection criteria and preparation methods provided prosecutors with crucial evidence while demonstrating the complete absence of empathy or remorse that characterized his participation in the family's crimes. The courtroom's reaction to his clinical descriptions of torture and murder reflected the public's horror at discovering how evil could be cultivated and nurtured within a family environment that claimed Christian values. The unraveling of the buyer network during the trial exposed a conspiracy that reached into respected institutions and prominent families throughout the northeastern United States. Federal investigators had traced the Harwick family's customer base through shipping records and financial documentation, revealing medical schools, private collectors, and adoption brokers who had knowingly participated in the commercial exploitation of murdered children. The arrests of buyers and accomplices in multiple states demonstrated the interstate scope of the criminal enterprise while providing additional evidence for prosecution efforts. The testimony of Dr. Harrison Wells from Johns Hopkins Medical School provided shocking evidence about the institutional corruption that had facilitated the Harwick family's crimes through the purchase of anatomical specimens from questionable sources. His admission that the medical school had purchased dozens of preserved child specimens from Constance Harwick without investigating their origin revealed how respected institutions could become complicit in systematic murder through willful ignorance about supplier methods. The revelation that prestigious medical schools had unknowingly used murdered children for educational purposes sparked national outrage and demands for reform in specimen acquisition procedures. The trial's exposure of corrupt law enforcement officials who had protected the Harwick family's operation led to a broader investigation of institutional failures that had enabled a decade of systematic child murder. Deputy Marshal Thomas Kellerman's detailed confession about accepting bribes to suppress investigations provided evidence for additional prosecutions while revealing the vulnerability of child welfare systems to corruption and abuse. His testimony about other officials who had been compromised by criminal enterprises highlighted the need for federal oversight of local law enforcement agencies responsible for protecting vulnerable populations. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against each member of the Harwick family, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the community's demand for justice on behalf of the murdered children. The verdict was accompanied by audible expressions of relief from spectators who had followed the trial proceedings and witnessed the systematic presentation of evidence documenting a decade of unspeakable cruelty. The speed of the jury's decision demonstrated that no reasonable doubt existed about the family's guilt in the systematic torture and murder of 19 innocent children. The sentencing phase of the trial became an opportunity for the community to express its outrage at the betrayal of trust that had allowed the Harwick family to prey on the most vulnerable members of society. Statements from former employees of the orphanage, community members who had supported the institution, and child welfare advocates emphasized the broader implications of the crimes beyond the immediate victims. The systematic nature of the murders and the family's abuse of religious authority to facilitate their crimes were cited as aggravating factors that demanded the maximum penalties available under federal law. The death sentences imposed on Edmund and Constance Harwick reflected the court's recognition that their crimes represented the ultimate betrayal of their duty to protect innocent children entrusted to their care. Marcus Harwick's sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole acknowledged his youth while ensuring that he would never again threaten vulnerable children. Evangeline's commitment to a psychiatric institution reflected the court's attempt to balance justice with recognition of her age and the psychological damage inflicted by her upbringing in a criminal household that had normalized child murder as acceptable family business. The broader implications of the Harwick case extended far beyond the prosecution of individual criminals to encompass fundamental questions about child protection, institutional oversight, and the prevention of systematic abuse within charitable organizations. The trial's revelations about the ease with which the family had deceived community members and official authorities highlighted critical gaps in the systems designed to protect orphaned and vulnerable children from exploitation and abuse. The execution of Edmund and Constance Harwick on November 12, 1889, marked the end of one of the most systematic child murder cases in American history while beginning a national conversation about institutional reform and child protection that would reshape orphanage oversight for generations. The public attendance at their execution, drawing thousands of spectators from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, reflected the community's need for closure after learning that trusted religious authorities had betrayed their sacred duty to protect innocent children. Edmund's final statement, a rambling attempt to justify his actions through distorted biblical interpretation, served only to reinforce public revulsion at his crimes and the manipulation of religious authority for criminal purposes. Marcus Harwick's life sentence at Eastern State Penitentiary removed him permanently from society while providing researchers with ongoing opportunities to study the psychological development of individuals raised within criminal households. His detailed confessions during imprisonment revealed additional victims and burial sites that had not been discovered during the initial investigation, bringing the total number of confirmed murders to 23 children over the family's 12-year operation. His clinical descriptions of torture methods and victim selection criteria provided valuable insights for law enforcement agencies developing protocols for investigating institutional abuse and systematic child exploitation. Evangeline Harwick's commitment to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane reflected the court's recognition that her participation in the family's crimes had been shaped by psychological damage inflicted during her formative years within a household that normalized murder and torture. Her psychiatric treatment, closely monitored by medical professionals studying the effects of criminal upbringing on personality development, revealed the complex relationship between childhood environment and adult criminal behavior. Her case became a landmark study in forensic psychology while raising important questions about accountability for individuals whose criminal actions resulted from systematic abuse during their developmental years. The permanent closure and demolition of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage in the spring of 1890 eliminated the physical site where systematic child murder had occurred while creating space for a memorial dedicated to the victims whose lives had been destroyed by institutional betrayal. The demolition process revealed additional evidence of the family's crimes, including concealed chambers and burial sites that had not been discovered during the initial investigation. The careful documentation of these findings provided closure for some families while reinforcing the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise that had operated behind the facade of Christian charity. The establishment of federal oversight standards for orphanages and child welfare institutions represented the most significant legislative response to the Harwick case, as Congress recognized the need for systematic protection against institutional abuse and exploitation. The Federal Child Protection Act of 1891 mandated regular inspections of charitable institutions, background investigations of staff and administrators, and standardized reporting procedures for child welfare agencies. These reforms, directly inspired by the systematic failures that had enabled the Harwick family's crimes, established precedents for federal intervention in child protection that would evolve throughout the following century. The memorial erected on the former site of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage honored the memory of the 19 confirmed victims while acknowledging the likelihood that additional children had been murdered whose remains were never recovered. The simple granite monument, inscribed with the names of known victims and a dedication to all children who had suffered institutional abuse, became a focal point for annual remembrance ceremonies that brought together child welfare advocates, community members, and survivors of institutional trauma. The memorial's inscription, calling for eternal vigilance against those who would exploit vulnerable children, served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of institutional failure and community complacency. Father Michael O'Brien's recognition as a national hero for his courage in exposing the Harwick family's crimes elevated him to prominence within the Catholic Church while establishing him as a leading advocate for child protection and institutional reform. His detailed documentation of investigative methods and evidence-gathering techniques became standard training material for law enforcement agencies dealing with institutional abuse cases. His subsequent career, dedicated to developing protocols for protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation, demonstrated how individual courage and determination could catalyze broader social reform when confronted with systematic evil. The broader impact of the Harwick case on American child welfare policy extended far beyond immediate legislative responses to encompass fundamental changes in how society viewed institutional care and the protection of vulnerable populations. The case's revelation that systematic child murder could occur within respected charitable institutions challenged assumptions about religious authority and community oversight while highlighting the need for professional training and legal accountability in child welfare work. The development of social work as a professional discipline drew heavily on lessons learned from the systematic failures that had enabled the Harwick family's crimes. The lasting influence of the case on criminal investigation procedures included the development of specialized techniques for uncovering institutional abuse and the systematic documentation of evidence in cases involving multiple victims and extended timeframes. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the methods used by federal investigators to expose the Harwick conspiracy while developing protocols for investigating similar cases involving institutional betrayal and systematic exploitation. The case established important precedents for federal jurisdiction in child protection cases and the coordination of multi-agency investigations spanning multiple states. As we conclude this investigation into one of America's most horrific child murder cases, we're reminded that evil can hide behind the most trusted institutions and respected authorities. The courage of individuals like Father O'Brien and the sacrifice of victims like Sarah Hennessy ensured that these crimes could not remain hidden forever. Their legacy lives on in the reforms that protect vulnerable children today. If this story has moved you to think differently about child protection and institutional accountability, we've honored the memory of those 19 innocent victims. Subscribe to our channel to join our community of truth seekers, hit that notification bell to never miss these important historical investigations, and let us know in the comments how you think we can better protect vulnerable children in our modern world. The transformation of child welfare practices following the Harwick case created lasting improvements in institutional oversight and professional standards that prevented similar systematic abuse while ensuring that the victims' deaths contributed to meaningful social progress. The development of mandatory reporting requirements, professional licensing standards, and regular institutional inspections created multiple layers of protection that made systematic institutional abuse significantly more difficult to conceal. The case's legacy continued to influence child protection policy throughout the 20th century as reformers cited the Harwick murders as evidence of the need for constant vigilance against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members. The annual remembrance ceremonies held at the memorial site served as powerful reminders that the price of protecting innocent children requires active engagement from community members, public officials, and child welfare professionals who must remain vigilant against institutional corruption and systematic abuse. The victims of the Harwick family's crimes, though denied the opportunity to live full lives, achieved a form of immortality through the reforms and protections that emerged from the exposure of their murders, ensuring that their deaths contributed to the safety of countless future generations of vulnerable children.